Greetings, sisters and brothers, from wherever you're tuning in today. Welcome to UNN TV. Tonight with Henry Gombya. I am Milton Allimadi. I'm sitting in for Henry Gombya this evening. First, we will play the national anthem, and then we'll get started with a fabulous show we have for you today. Let's go ahead with the national anthem.
Oh, Uganda, may God uphold thee. We lay our future in thy hand. United, free, for liberty, together we'll always stand. Oh, Uganda, the land of freedom, our love and labor we give, and with neighbors all at our country's calling, peace and friendship.
Okay. Welcome back, sisters and brothers. I am today's guest host, Milton Allimadi. I publish Black Star News here in New York City, and I'm also an adjunct professor of African history at John Jay College here in New York, and adjunct professor of journalism at Columbia University, also here in the New York City. So welcome on this 5th day of December to Tonight with Henry Gombya. Henry can't be with us tonight, so I am guest hosting. There are many topics, but first I want to start off. Whenever you hear that beautiful, beautiful national anthem of Uganda, our beloved country, and then you start correlating it with the history of our beloved country since independence, and it makes you really wonder, do we really deserve that national anthem? Have we lived up to the promises of the national anthem? And of course, the answer is no, absolutely not. But we should be glad we have such a beautiful national anthem because it makes us aspire to keep working to achieve all of those visions that are outlined in the national anthem. And it can be done. But there are a number of things we need to do, and that is going to be part of tonight's discussion, an open conversation. I want to touch on at least 4 critical topics, depending on how much time we have. Tonight's special show will last for about an hour. One of the issues I would like to start off with is the nature of the regime in Uganda. We have an illegitimate regime in Uganda, and that has become much, much clearly so since the elections of January 14. For the first time ever, the United States government, without which the regime cannot survive, issued a very strong statement. If anybody is not familiar with that statement, I advise you to go to the website of the State Department. The statement says clearly, the elections were neither free nor fair. It does not get as explicit as that. And governments normally do not make such a definitive, explicit statement unless they're willing to live with any consequences and ramifications. You make a statement like that when you're ready to even rupture relations with that regime. Because if you're saying the election is not free, the election is not fair, it means the regime that claimed alleged victory is an illegitimate regime. And that has profound consequences. The United States cannot be in the business of dealing with a legitimate regime. And many countries around the world listen to the signal from the United States, particularly its European partners, Britain and the EU countries. And it was not by coincidence that the EU Parliament also issued a very strong statement, basically advising the EU member countries to institute Magnitsky sanctions against the regime, which of course includes travel bans against members of the regime. It includes asset freeze of members of the regime. And that statement actually came before the United States statement. Now, the problem with the EU Parliament is that the EU Parliament is not as powerful as the individual member countries of the EU. So even though the statement was very strong, condemned the violence that accompanied the so-called elections of January, including the massacre. Yes, that's what it was, a massacre of Ugandan civilians on November 18. And every time we refer to that killing, we must remind the world that was a massacre. But the problem with the EU is that the parliament has limited power. The member countries are the ones that we really need to put pressure on. So we need to go to powerful countries, EU members such as France and Germany, and say, now that your own EU Parliament has made this definitive statement condemning the violence, advising you to put in place sanctions against regime officials, political and military, how can you ignore that statement? How can you conduct business as usual? Of course, we don't want our sisters and brothers in Uganda to suffer. If you're going to be involved in any development programs, it should go directly to the beneficiaries. There are ways to bypass an illegitimate regime and still support the citizens of Uganda. So that should be our message to the EU member countries, particularly the powerful ones with strong economies, such as France and Germany. I'm very encouraged to see Ugandan sisters and brothers engaging these governments on social media, particularly on Twitter. Twitter, of course, is a very powerful means of agitation, of protest, and of registering our voice. And I'm going to talk about a few examples of how Twitter campaigns have been very, very powerful. But I want to go back briefly to the US statement by the Biden administration. In addition to saying, basically, this is an illegitimate regime, the statement also includes a number of other very strong information. Number one, a visa restriction was placed on regime members, political and military, that were involved in the violence that preceded the election, the violence that accompanied the election, and the subsequent violence after the stolen elections. It said these individuals are impacted by the visa ban, and additionally, there would be further action against these individuals depending on what continues to happen. And what has continued to happen in Uganda? The kidnapping campaign of young Ugandans, innocent civilians, has continued. the torture of Ugandans has continued, and even the false charges against two members of the NUP, members of parliament, who have been falsely accused by this illegitimate regime of being involved in murder. It's completely preposterous. And as we know, these members of parliament have also been tortured. So based on what has been transpiring under this illegitimate regime of General Yoweri Museveni, and based on the statement made April 16 by the Biden administration, we believe it is time to revisit that statement and take the additional action which was promised in that statement, depending on what transpires subsequent to the issuing of that statement. If the US administration is to live up to its own words, which are still on the statement posted on the website of the State Department, then surely it is time for additional action to be taken by the Biden administration. It has been encouraging to know that at least this administration seems to be taking its position relative to General Museveni's illegitimate regime seriously. For example, when the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, recently visited East Africa, in the past, it would be almost automatic, without a doubt, that the United States Secretary of State would go to Entebbe and Kampala and meet dictator Museveni. This did not happen on this occasion. The Secretary of State went to Kenya, in addition to visiting Nigeria and Senegal. So this was an open display of the contempt that this administration now has for General Museveni's illegitimate regime. So it's encouraging, but it's still not enough. So it is up to us as sisters and Ugandans and sisters and brothers of Uganda, on behalf of our comrades back home and in diaspora, to keep insisting and demanding that the administration live up to the rest of the commitment that was made in that very important statement. I want to keep emphasizing, if anybody is not familiar with that statement, please go to the website of the State Department, or you can Google it. U.S. Statement on Uganda Elections, April 16, 2021. If you do a Google search on that, it should take you straight to the link. Read that statement, share it with other Ugandans so that everybody is on the same page. Dictator Museveni knows how serious that statement is. When a major country like the United States, which sends about $1 billion in military and financial support to the Ugandan regime, now turns around and says, you are actually not legitimate, that is a very serious statement. That is a statement that we, as Ugandans, need to remind the regime in Uganda, Museveni's military regime, that you are actually not legitimate. But much more importantly, we need to remind the United States that you have now said his is not a legitimate regime. So there are some things you can no longer do in terms of dealing with this regime. It cannot be business as usual. It reminds me of back in the day during the era of the apartheid white minority racist regime in South Africa, or the illegitimate white minority regime in what was then Rhodesia. And both those countries used to hold these bogus so-called elections, you know? And in that case, it was very simple. It was based on the color of the skin. Only Europeans were allowed to vote. Africans were excluded. And yet they tried to call themselves legitimate government. But most countries did not recognize them and kept referring to them as an illegitimate regime. And I submit that is how we must keep referring to the Museveni regime as well. A regime that conducts so-called elections, massacres civilians prior to the election, kills people on the day of the vote, stuffs the ballot boxes using the armed forces, and the videos clearly are showing this, kidnaps and kills returning officers who have the legitimate forms showing how people actually voted. And then it wants to call itself a legitimate regime. There's no difference between the conduct of this tyrant compared to the tyrants who were operating the regimes in Rhodesia and in apartheid South Africa. Now, instead of using the color of the skin, what does the dictator use? He is one of Africa's most notorious ethnic bigots. There's no race difference between a racist and an ethnic bigot. A racist uses the color of the skin to discriminate and to oppress and to exploit. And that is what was being conducted by the white minority regime in Rhodesia and in apartheid South Africa. Here, in our case in Uganda, we have a so-called African using the same tactics: discrimination, exploitation, violence, only this time based on what part of the country where you come from, what ethnicity you belong to. And that is why I call this ethnic apartheid. And General Museveni is an ethnic bigot. No difference between him and the notorious Ian Smith, who was presiding over Rhodesia, or Pick Bota, de Klerk, Forster, Malan, and all those racists who operated the brutal apartheid regime. So that is my commentary on illegitimacy. Every time I write an article or a column or I discuss the regime in Uganda, I always mention illegitimate military regime of General Yoweri Museveni. If you do a Google search and you read many articles from the past about apartheid South Africa, about Rhodesia, you would see in most of the articles, the reference would be to illegitimate regime. And that is important because people start talking about it, officials make statement about it, and it affects the attitude and conduct of the rest of the world in dealing with that illegitimate regime. And that should be in the case of Uganda. We cannot allow a person who has been illegitimately in power for 35 years to continue hijacking Uganda's taxpayer money to then buy weapons and use the same weapons bought with Ugandan taxpayers' money or foreign aid, to use those same weapons to kill Ugandan civilians. We can't allow that. We just cannot. And that's why we have to keep referring to this as an illegitimate regime. And if a regime is illegitimate, it means people are authorized to defy it and to remove it and to replace it with a legitimate regime. All countries are governed by legitimate regimes. So why should we, as Ugandans, accept that we should have an administration which is not legitimate? So that is my comment on the illegitimacy of the military or militaristic General Yoweri Museveni regime that we now have in Uganda. Now I want to talk about another issue, actually two issues that are interrelated. The issue of the recent series of bombings in and around Kampala, and then recent announcement that soldiers have once again invaded our sister republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, our neighboring sister country. People are highly suspicious of the bombings that have occurred in Uganda, and rightly so, because the regime lies all the time. Remember, just before the Biden administration was sworn into office, remember what happened? The regime, the spokesperson of the military, put out a statement saying Ugandan forces in Somalia had engaged against terrorists, wiping out more than 100. And this became global news. If you're not familiar with that incident, please go back and do the research, do a Google search, and you'll see all these stories coming out. And what was the purpose of that story? It seemed a bit too convenient, because now you have a new administration of Joe Biden coming in to replace the Trump administration. And the regime had really tried its best to endear itself to Donald Trump. And with all his faults, all his incompetence, at least he did not allow the Museveni regime to become close to his administration. The regime was desperate. Remember when Donald Trump insulted Africa, said Africa was a collection of shithole countries? General Museveni was the only African misruler who stood up publicly and said, "I love Donald Trump." Have you forgotten that statement? I hope not. I hope not. You know, any one of you who may have experienced a news blackout at that period and is not familiar with that statement, once again, as I always do, I advise people to do the research, because I want people to read these things that I talk about for themselves. You know, because nowadays anybody can say anything, and there are a lot of people who just talk nonsense. That's why when I am having a conversation with you, I prefer to refer you to the sources, multiple sources, not just one source, so you can read it for yourself. It was all over the news. That is what the dictator said. "I love Donald Trump," after Trump had insulted Africa. And this is a guy who talks about being a Pan-African. What nonsense. This is a guy who actually secretly hates Africa and hates Africans. I'm not talking about Trump. I'm talking about General Museveni. How can an African who claims to love Africa and be a Pan-African say, "I love" a European who has just insulted Africans and said shithole countries? Does that add up? Of course it does not add up. But you can even ask a bigger question. How can a man who has been responsible for the deaths of millions of Africans, this is Museveni, in Uganda, in Rwanda, because you know, if Uganda had never invaded Rwanda in 1990, the genocide of 1994 never would have occurred, right? Invaded South Sudan, invaded Congo multiple times, leading to the deaths of millions of Africans. Is this to you the sign of a person who loves Africans? No. So now going back to this bombing incident, if we relate it to the lie that the regime issued about Somalia, which of course eventually they had to back off the lie once it was widely exposed. You can't kill more than 100 people and then there are no bodies, right? And they have the satellite technology. The US and its military could just capture the images, and the images showed nothing. There was no confrontation. So that is why when you see an incident like the bombings in Kampala, people are highly suspicious. They think the regime itself might be involved in these incidents to divert attention from the tremendous public pressure from domestic as well as internationally that the regime has been facing. And that brings us to what has happened next, the invasion of the Congo, allegedly to pursue the quote-unquote terrorist belonging to the ADL. And there was another lie, if you remember. The regime said there would be a joint coordinated military operation with the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Congolese government came out publicly and said there was no such agreement. This was just another one of those Museveni lies. So now I think we are at the midpoint of today's conversation. We should take a short break, and then we should return for the rest of our discussion today. So yes, why don't we take a short, brief break right now, and then come back for the second half of our show.
This is the moment the first bomb exploded in Kampala. At a checkpoint at the Central Police Station, exactly 3 minutes later, a second went off near the Parliament building. 3 suicide bombers were involved. They were killed along with 3 other people. Dozens were injured. This footage was released by the police, who said a 4th man was arrested and a suicide jacket found at his home.
Very unfortunate. It's happening at such a time that we're trying to go back to our normal livelihoods. So if these people can come at such a premises of police and set off a bomb, then things are not good.
The aftermath shows how powerful the blasts were. Broken windows, burning vehicles, and terrified people. Police say the attacks were carried out by a gang working alongside the Allied Democratic Forces. The armed group has its roots in Uganda, but is now based in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Its fighters have killed thousands of people in the east in recent years.
The hallmarks of the attack clearly indicate that the ADF-linked radicalized groups who still have a desire to carry out lethal attacks on soft targets using suicide attackers and improvised explosive devices behind these attacks.
This attack follows 2 others last month. One killed a waitress in a restaurant, and a second on a bus 2 days later injured several people. ISIL claimed those attacks. The ADF has pledged its allegiance to the group.
The involvement of the Ugandan army in the peacekeeping missions in the region, especially in Somalia, makes Uganda a target of some of these groups.
What's happening in Uganda also comes at a time when the military is planning to deploy its soldiers to eastern DRC to help Congolese troops and UN peacekeepers fight ADF. There, they'll help Congolese troops and UN peacekeepers to fight ADF forces. Catherine Soy, Al Jazeera.
Chief Justice Owini Dolo is a former private lawyer to Tibuhaburwa and involved in the constitutional change of the term limit in 2005. Whilst in 2017, he also participated as panel judge in the infamous constitutional change of the age limit, famously known as Toji Kwatako, which gave Tibuhaburwa a further hand at impinging on the Ugandan people's human rights. In all cases, he has been involved as panel judge, including Dr. Chiza Besige's election petitions. He has served the dictator's interests. Michael Chibita is a former private secretary of Museveni, aka Tibuhaburwa. Overwhelming evidence from the survivors and victims of the Museveni state terror suggests that Michael Chibita frustrated, blocked and subverted justice in all the high-profile murder cases that occurred just before or during his tenure as the Directorate of Public Prosecution, DPP of Uganda. These cases include Nsenga, Afande Haji Sebagala, Magistrate Mafabi, Wilberforce Wamala and many more, including delayed justice for Masaka businessman Godfrey Katoka Juri. The families of the murdered people have never received justice. Those who narrowly survived the premeditated murders continue to live in fear and are now refugees abroad. Extrajudicial kidnappings and killings of Ugandans have only worsened due to the impunity that Chibita has actively participated in. These cases are among many that have been lodged at the International Criminal Court, ICC, against Tibuhaburwa. Don't forget that Tibuhaburwa appointed Chibita in all the positions he has held to date, as his former private secretary, legal judge of the High Court, DPP as Supreme Court judge, and now as a member of the petition panel to seal the rubber stamp to Tibuhaburwa's rigged victory.
Welcome back, viewers. Once again, I'm Milton Allimadi. I am guest hosting for our colleague, Henry Gombya. So welcome to Tonight with Henry Gombya on UNN TV for the second half hour of today's special discussion. I now want to turn our attention to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And in the earlier segment, when we were discussing the bombings in Kampala, you saw the Al Jazeera news piece. And I hope you paid attention to the very end of that segment from Al Jazeera. If you recall what that ending said, the ending said, these bombings in Kampala come at a time when Uganda is getting ready to intervene in the Congo? Just think about that carefully, because I want to encourage us, sisters and brothers, Ugandans, to be wise consumers of information. We cannot live in a world where you just somebody say something and you believe it just because he's wearing a police uniform or the black official police uniform, and he has those epaulets, looks smart standing behind a microphone. It doesn't mean he's not lying. So you have to listen carefully and piece all the information together. That is how you become a wise consumer of information. So what do I mean in this instance? When you're being told that Uganda apparently had already been planning for a long time to invade Congo, right? Now, you can't invade another country with no reason at all, right? Even though General Museveni has done it in the past, right? You know, as I said earlier, invaded Rwanda, invaded Congo, invaded South Sudan, he's invaded Central African Republic, right? But you're not supposed to do that. Even for a reckless person like General Museveni, you need to have an excuse, something you can sell to the public in Uganda and to the international community. So for many, many weeks, in fact, months, the regime had been talking about the need to invade Congo. Why? My own position is because the regime is facing tremendous domestic internal pressure. You see? So it needs to find an outlet for the military, because the military, if they're too idle, they cause trouble for the commander-in-chief himself. So he has to keep them busy, you see? And that's why he's been invading all these countries. So he needs an invasion of Congo more than Ugandans have ever needed to go into the Congo, you see? And that is why we must treat with the highest degree of suspicion when we see these bombings now starting in Uganda. Because you and I know that that can be used as the justification to do something the regime had wanted to do all along. Invade Congo, set another fire. You know, that's one thing Museveni is very good at. Like an arsonist. An arsonist is somebody who burns down houses, you see? And when there's a fire in one house, if your house is not burning, all the attention is going to be focused on the house which is on fire. So even with all his problems in Uganda, let me give you a few examples. What did he do? General Museveni invaded South Sudan. There was a big fire, untold suffering, when other African countries were trying to negotiate a peace between Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, his vice president. All the IGAD countries, all the East African leaders were trying to get them to negotiate. What does Museveni do? He sends his army to take one side with Salva Kiir against Riek Machar. Hundreds of thousands of people died. 1 million refugees from South Sudan fled to neighboring countries, mostly to Uganda. Suddenly, Uganda became a peaceful country compared to South Sudan. You see? So the arsonist, General Museveni, set a bigger fire in South Sudan to make Uganda look relatively peaceful. In fact, he started welcoming refugees from South Sudan. Although when that happened, I remember on Black Star News, we wrote editorials. We said, if you're going to send money, don't send it through Museveni's regime, because the money is going to be stolen. Anybody can Google that editorial we wrote years ago, you know? Google the search words Museveni stealing money for South Sudan refugees, and then put Black Star News, and you will see a couple of articles will come up. Why? Because a thief is always a thief. A bandit is always a bandit. It's always a killer. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a nuclear scientist to know what was going to happen. And sure enough, the money was stolen. Millions of dollars were stolen. In fact, they suspended, as some of the EU countries suspended further support for the refugees because the money was going to Museveni and his close associates, people like his foreign minister, Sam Kutesa, and other regime insiders, and his family. Now let's go back to the Congo. What happened the last time Uganda invaded the Congo? Multiple times between 1997 and 2005, occupied Eastern Congo, particularly the Ituri region, committed some of the most horrendous atrocities the Congolese had ever seen. In fact, even during Mobutu's regime, and Mobutu, of course, was one of the most corrupt leaders in Africa, although Museveni has proven now that he's definitely more corrupt than Mobutu, and certainly much more violent in terms of the people who have been killed, raped, tortured under one misruler. Museveni exceeds what Mobutu ever did. And why am I bringing Mobutu into this comparison? And once again, for people that are not used to the information I'm sharing, I always insist on going to the source. So I would like you to Google and research blood in Ituri region in the Congo. That's ITURI. And read the documents of some of the most horrendous atrocities you will ever hear committed by Ugandan soldiers ordered to invade Congo by their commander-in-chief, General Museveni. And the crimes have a remarkable similarity to the atrocities committed by Uganda's army under Museveni's order within Uganda. In the West, with the Kasese atrocities. In Central, when the regime tried to block the Kabaka from visiting parts of his own region. In the East, when people were put in train wagons, abandoned train wagons, and roasted alive. And then, of course, in the northern part of the country. One of the most unique crimes that had never occurred before, and this is not to say that all the other crimes were not terrible, of course they were, but a new type of crime started being committed in the northern part of Uganda by Museveni's military. And that was to rape not only women, but to rape men as well. Men raped in front of their families, for two purposes primarily: to humiliate the family completely, and also to spread HIV/AIDS. So why am I bringing this up? Because in the Congo, the same types of rape started being committed, raping both women and men. This was unheard of in the Congo, just as it had been unheard of in the northern part of Uganda before the troops started committing these types of rapes. And as I said earlier, all rapes are horrific and criminal, whether it's women, whether it's men. But I'm just bringing this up because this was a new phenomenon. And even during all the years of Mobutu's atrocities, that type of abuse had never occurred in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So think about it. So it was not surprising that at the end of the day, the Congo took Uganda to the International Court of Justice Now, people sometimes confuse the two, so let me just give you a brief explanation. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, is also known as the World Court. That is where countries take their civil disputes for arbitration, for trial, for judgment, and for decision to be rendered. So that's the one court. The other court is the International Criminal Court, which is the ICC, which can indict individuals criminally, such as Bashir, Omar Hassan al-Bashir, the former president or misruler of Sudan. He has been indicted, and the ICC has been trying to get him to be taken there. In the case of the Congo, they took the matter of the Ugandan atrocities, the invasion, the occupation, to the ICJ. And Uganda sent lawyers to defend itself. Congo sent lawyers. And the court had the matter, and they ruled in Congo's favor. And in 2005, ordered Uganda to pay Congo $10 billion. Not one penny or shilling has been paid up to date. 10 billion in 2005. So add the interest to that amount, and you can imagine how much all of us as Ugandan citizens, we owe Congo because of the military adventure of this one individual, the illegitimate ruler of Uganda. So why am I bringing this all up? Because now, once again, Uganda has invaded Congo. Who knows what atrocities the military, under the command of Commander-in-Chief, General Museveni, could commit in the Congo once again. And the Congo could take Uganda once again to the International Court of Justice, the World Court. And the World Court could render another favorable decision for the Congo and add billions of additional dollars upon the 10 billion plus interest, which by the way, if we are not careful, the Congo, which has already won the judgment, can start attaching and putting liens on Ugandan assets around the world, including our embassies, including that Gulfstream jet that Museveni flies around the world with, that jet bought with foreign donation, foreign aid, which was meant to help Uganda, of course. That jet, if it lands in London, New York, I don't think it'll come to New York for a long time because the US put the travel restriction. The US did not announce the names of the individuals on that list. But if the name is supposed to be people responsible for the election abuse, the killings, and the rigged election, then of course it means Museveni is on that list. So he may not fly to the US. But let's say he flies to London or any other city where the Congo has a diplomatic presence. Congo can put a lien on that plane and say this belongs to the government and the people of Congo based on the $10 billion that we owe the Congo. So that's why it's very serious. We should not take this invasion very lightly. Museveni may want it to divert attention, but to us as Ugandans, it means we're going to end up paying a lot more money to our sisters and brothers in the Congo. Of course, once the illegitimate regime in Uganda has been removed, our sisters and brothers in Congo could be understanding, and they could say, listen, we know Ugandans, you are sisters and brothers, we love each other, so we can forgive you for that invasion. It was not a Ugandan people's invasion. It was the invasion engineered by a dictator who was just trying to stay in power by any means necessary, him and his regime. So, hopefully the Congolese can understand one day. But for now, as of today, with Museveni still in power, we owe them $10 billion plus interest and the possibility of owing them more, depending on what happens with this invasion. Now, in the remaining time we have left, sisters and brothers, I would like to talk on one other critical aspect. Because as we know, the regime is desperate. It is not surviving because of the support of the people of Uganda. You saw the election. You saw the millions of people that came out, the young people, and voted for Nup and Bobby Wine as the legitimate president of Uganda. You saw that. So obviously, the regime does not get its support from domestic constituency. No, the regime survives based on foreign support. And it's remarkable that the great Pan-Africanist, who would have never said, I love Donald Trump if he's alive today, and I'm talking about Kwame Nkrumah, of course, wrote a very important book in 1965. And I know many young people, sometimes we don't like reading, but I encourage you to read this book by Kwame Nkrumah called Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. Yes, it's worth every penny, every dollar you pay for this book. You can get it on Amazon. In that book, Nkrumah said the most dangerous African leader is going to be the one who does not care about domestic election, because his support, his remaining in power is not based on how popular he is domestically. He said it would be a ruler whose rule depends on support from outside, from the West, and from the financial institutions. This book was written in 1965, but it is describing General Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. He doesn't care about what Ugandans think about him. Steals elections blatantly. He turns the numbers upside down. When the opposition gets 60% and he gets 30, he just flips it around and gives himself the 60 and the opposition the 30. That's what he did against Bobby Wine and previous candidates. It's the same thing against Dr. Kizza Besigye. And this is the person that Nkrumah described in his 1965 book, because Nkrumah was a visionary. He analyzed Africa and how the outside world dealt with Africa. And he knew exactly this would be very convenient for the West. So Museveni is very convenient for the West. He's very destructive for us Ugandans, but very useful and convenient for the West. And that brings me to the final point I wanted to make: the World Bank and the IMF. Since the COVID pandemic, the World Bank and the IMF have made available as close to 1.6 going to $2 billion to the Museveni regime, even though both institutions know the record of corruption and theft and embezzlement by this regime. They read the newspapers. They know what happened to all the money that was sent, supposedly to help refugees in Uganda. They know what happened with past IMF and World Bank projects in Uganda, when there are also issues of corruption. And yet they still released this substantial sum of money, starting with the World Bank and then the IMF. But I'm happy to say I was part of the Ugandan diaspora community that traveled to Washington, D.C., and we launched protests in front of the offices of the World Bank, the IMF, and the State Department. We went on numerous occasions. I know I was involved in at least 2 or 3 of those protests in Washington, D.C. And the protests were worth it. And how do I know they were worth it? Because recently, The Economist wrote an article saying Now, these institutions, IMF, World Bank, are saying they're going to be monitoring how the money that they lend to African countries are being used. And they specifically mentioned Cameroon and Equatorial Guinea. The Economist people who produce The Economist, are not stupid people. They're very smart. They are aware that this cannot be a coincidence, that this new position by the IMF and World Bank came after Ugandans had done the protest, which was not only in person, but also online, digitally. It was a huge Twitter campaign, and it must continue. I encourage every Ugandan, get involved in demanding for accountability. When you tweet, the Twitter handle for the World Bank is @World Bank. So the @ sign and then World, WRLD, Bank, all one word. And for the IMF, it is @IMF News. So @ sign and then IMF News, NEWS, one word. Always make sure you have these handles together in your tweet. And what is the tweet that we need to do this time, addressing the World Bank and the IMF? Because, sisters and brothers, you are only abused to the extent that you allow yourself to be abused, right? So it was only after we showed up and we protested that the World Bank and IMF knew we meant business. And they came out with this new statement. In fact, in the case of Uganda, they were supposed to give the regime $1 billion, right, this past summer. But because of our protest, we don't think it's a coincidence. They announced that the money is going to be released in smaller parts to give them time to monitor whatever amount is being released, how it's being spent. Do you think they would have done that had we not had the protest in person and digitally? Of course not. They couldn't just wake up one day and say, oh, today we are going to demand accountability from this dictator in African countries. No. So protests work. So this is what I want people now to remind the IMF and the World Bank. Since the United States, in its statement on April 16, has said is not legitimate because the election was neither free nor fair, why are you, the IMF and World Bank, lending $1 billion to an illegitimate regime? This is incompetence. A major institution like that has a fiduciary obligation to the shareholders. And the United States government and United States people are the largest shareholders of both the World Bank and the IMF. Why are you exposing US assets as part of the World Bank assets to this illegitimate tyrant in Uganda? And I'm not just asking this as a rhetorical question. Obviously, I want people to tweet this question and use the Twitter handle I just gave you at World Bank and at IMF News. But there's another thing that we Ugandan sisters and brothers can consider. We can get some of our smart lawyers, our brilliant Ugandan sisters and brothers who are lawyers, and we can file legal action against the World Bank. In 2019, the US Supreme Court, in a historic ruling, made a ruling that, in fact, the World Bank can be sued. So before that ruling in 2019, people thought the World Bank was 100% immune, protected from lawsuits. But this historic ruling, and the ruling came from a community in South Asia where the World Bank had loaned money to put into this project that wiped out the agricultural production of that region and directly affected the livelihoods and the lives of those victims. As a result of that historic lawsuit, which went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, a decision was rendered that indeed, if money loaned by the World Bank harms local communities, then they can be exposed to a lawsuit. And in our case, there's been tremendous harm because the money loaned by the World Bank or the IMF, diverted by the regime into military assets, and then the military assets used to kill Ugandans. I think that should qualify as harming the community. So let's start, first of all, by protesting, by tweeting, saying, why are you lending money to a legitimate regime? Let's send as many tweets as we can. But then afterwards, let's talk to some of our very smart lawyers and let's take legal action against the World Bank so that they know we mean serious business. We will not allow any entity to be in the involvement of exploiting, torturing, killing our sisters and brothers in Uganda. So sisters and brothers, I now bring today's discussion to a close. I hope that you found the information productive and useful. And I look forward once again to either returning on tonight with Henry Gombya as a guest here on UNN TV. And I certainly look forward to being a guest host once again on a future date. And if you want to also be in touch with me, you can follow me at Allimadi on Twitter, or you can also contact me by email at mallimadi@gmail.com. That's MALLIMAD like David, I. So it's mallimadi@gmail.com. So I thank you all, sisters and brothers. Stay strong, stay healthy, and I look forward to our next conversation. May the Creator bless you and protect you and your family. Thank you very much.